This story is about an alien doctor who thinks his human patient's organs are melting, but the human says he's just sweating. Lieutenant Mark Weller had only meant to take a jog, a light one. He'd been on rotation for 3 days straight aboard the Diligence, which wasn't unusual, but what made it brutal was the climate controls glitching. The ship had spent 2 of those days stuck near a volatile gas giant, soaking up solar radiation like a steel frying pan, and the air systems had been pumping out warm air ever since. So when Mark returned from his jog, shirt soaked, breathing heavy, his skin sheened with sweat and his socks making that squishing noise no sock ever should, he hadn't expected to cause an interspecies incident. Yet here he was, on a cold metal examination bed, stripped to his waist, while Dr. Vattrell, chief xenobiologist and ship's medic, reeled backward, with all 6 eyes wide and all 4 hands trembling. "Containment breach," the doctor croaked, already reaching for the red panel that no one ever wanted touched. Mark blinked slowly. "What?" "Internal fluid loss exceeding tolerable volume. Structural integrity of dermal layer compromised. Your organs are melting." Mark sighed and lay back, forearm over his eyes. "I'm just sweating, Doc." The room fell into a stunned silence for a full 3 seconds before Vattrell stabbed the red panel anyway. Alarms blared. The ceiling irised open to reveal retractable sterilization pods. Vents hissed. 2 medbots rolled in at full speed, spraying sanitizing foam like terrified firefighters attacking a grease fire. One bounced off Mark's knee, failed to correct course, and slammed into the side wall with a tragic little blah. Mark coughed, propped up on one elbow, and watched foam drip from the ceiling. "Really?" he muttered. Chief Engineer Salinas burst through the door moments later in a full bodysuit, accompanied by 2 security officers and someone from waste management who had, apparently, heard melting organs and decided they might be needed. "Report!" Salinas barked, aiming a scanner at Mark's chest. Vattrell turned, visibly shaken. His outer membrane is leaking fluids, rapidly. Unknown chemical profile, high sodium count, elevated urea indicators. Salinas looked at the scanner, then looked at Mark. "You're just sweating, aren't you?" "That's what I've been trying to tell him." One of the medbots attempted to apply adhesive sealant to Mark's shoulder. It missed, and glued his arm to the table. "Please don't take this the wrong way," said the waste manager, "but your species is terrifying." Vattrell was pacing now, muttering to himself, the translator struggling to keep up. "His thermal control system, external fluid emission, no, subdermal blistering, is this deliberate internal liquefaction?" "Nope," Mark said, wriggling to peel his arm free. "It's called cooling. Humans do it to survive heat, some of us more than others." Salinas sighed and rubbed her forehead. "Doc, humans sweat. It's normal." Vattrell stopped. His voice, when it returned, was filled with academic horror. "This is not normal in any biological context. Losing that much liquid voluntarily is classified under biodisintegration on at least 17 catalogued worlds." Mark gave a weak thumbs up. "We call it cardio." Laughter broke the tension. The medbots beeped in uncertain agreement. Even the waste guy chuckled. It took another 15 minutes for the alarms to be disabled, the foam to be cleaned up, and Mark to be unglued. Vattrell, for his part, apologized while also taking no responsibility. "I will be revising the species file on humans. Again," he muttered. "I'll send you some footage from a sauna," Mark offered, stretching his shoulder. "I don't know what that is, but I'm already afraid." Vattrell was halfway through recalibrating his diagnostic pod when another alert flashed across his terminal. Subtle, but persistent. "Trace atmospheric acidity rising. Source, crew deck ventilation." He frowned, adjusted his readings, and ran the diagnostic again. Still climbing. The internal sensors began tracing patterns through the corrosive trails so faint they almost went unnoticed. They weren't from the medfoam, not from coolant, not even from the failing climate systems. They tracked through the ship like invisible fingerprints, straight from the gym bay, past the mess hall, into med bay, right to the chair where Mark had been sitting. Vatro leaned in. The acidity matched human sweat, but not entirely. Something in it had changed. The computer flagged it as anomalous vapor formation due to xenobiotic compound interaction. He froze. Something was melting after all, but not the human. Not yet. Dr. Vatral didn't sleep, not that his species required sleep in the way humans did, but he typically entered a meditative hypostasis cycle at least twice every lunar standard. That evening, however, he remained perched over his terminal, all four hands flicking through ship schematics, chemical interaction databases, and the Human Anatomy Reference Archive with the kind of manic focus usually reserved for active biohazard crises. Because now, it was one. The computer had traced a narrow thread of acidity through ventilation shafts. Microscopic corrosion etched faint, meandering lines through alloy panels. Not catastrophic, not even critical, but a sign, a warning, and it all originated from Lieutenant Mark Weller's sweat. Except sweat, by itself, didn't eat through ship-grade polymer. Vatral opened the environmental logs. Less than 6 hours ago, Mark had completed a jog on Deck 5 specifically, in Corridor 5 Delta, adjacent to the Arboretum. He cross-referenced the location with the ship's maintenance records. 3 days ago, a minor containment breach had occurred in the Arboretum's fungal biome. Harmless, the report had claimed. Sealed in 20 minutes. The species in question had no documented interaction with humans. Yet no samples had been taken. No one had thought to test how the alien spores might behave when exposed to something as common as human sweat. Vatral straightened. "No one's melting," he said aloud, "but something else is." He activated the intercom. "Medbay to engineering, immediate priority." Mark wasn't feeling great the next morning, which wasn't unusual after a long run, a surprise sterilization foam bath, and having half the crew stare at your bare torso like you just vomited fire. But what was unusual was the lingering headache and the throat irritation. He chalked it up to the disinfectants. They'd sprayed him like he was a roach in a motel bathroom. Still, the sweat clung to him differently now, not just salty but slightly tacky. His undershirt had stiffened overnight, like it had been starched. He showered. Twice. Then shoved the shirt in the laundry recycler and made his way to the mess hall. Chief Salinas was already seated, poking at a tray of protein synth with the kind of look usually reserved for tax audits and unflushed public toilets. "Morning," Mark croaked, grabbing a mug of synth caf. She squinted. "You sound like someone gargled steel wool." "Feel like it, too. Could be stress. Could be that the doc's been trying to contact you since 400. Mark paused mid-sip. "Seriously?" "Yup. Something about persistent acidic anomalies and environmental integrity compromise." Sounded excited. "Terrific." The second he stepped into medbay, Vatral sealed the door behind him and deactivated the room's air circulation. Mark glanced around. "Am I being quarantined?" "You're not contagious," Vatral said, "but I'm not taking chances." That's never a comforting phrase. Vatral pulled up the scan overlays and gestured toward the central holo display. "These red lines? Corrosive traces in the air filtration ducts. Pattern matches your movement throughout the ship." Mark raised an eyebrow. "You think I'm leaking acid?" "Not intentionally," Vatral said. "But your sweat after contact with a specific airborne spore is producing a vapor that becomes mildly corrosive when agitated by environmental circulation." Mark rubbed his temple. "Doc, I just ran through a hallway. I didn't dunk myself in alien fungus." "No, you walked through a spore cloud that had settled undetected near Corridor 5 Delta. The spores themselves are inert to most species, but when combined with human eccrine secretion, just say sweat. The compound alters, bonding with trace minerals and lipids. The result is a vapor that degrades synthetic polymer and causes mild respiratory irritation." Mark's headache suddenly felt less like stress and more like a red flag. "Okay, so, what's the plan?" Vatral's tone grew unusually serious. "We need to decontaminate your skin, scrub your sweat glands, and run a full purge of the air system. You also need to avoid strenuous activity, no heat exposure, no cardio, no emotional distress. Mark blinked. Doc, you're telling me not to feel emotions? I'm telling you to not sweat. For at least 48 hours. You know that's not a switch I can flip, right? I am aware, Vatral said with grim resignation, which is why I've requisitioned an adaptive cooling suit. I'm not wearing a space diaper. It's more like a second skin. Definitely not better. It has tiny fans. Mark sighed. Fine, but I'm not sitting in here alone like some kind of walking hazmat alert. Agreed, Vatral said, which is why I've recruited assistants. At that cue, a new figure entered the room. A tall, broad-chested Zyran named Keela, one of the ship's environmental safety officers, who gave Mark a slow, considering look. I will be monitoring your temperature. Mark raised both eyebrows. You volunteered for this? No. I lost a bet. By 1100, Mark was back on duty, walking slowly, carefully, encased in a suit that made a faint whirring noise every time he moved. Crew members gave him wide berth in the halls. At least one cadet dropped her datapad and bolted after spotting him near the lift. This is humiliating, Mark muttered. Better than dissolving Deck 7, Keela said without turning. I didn't even sweat that much. You burned through 2 millimeters of vent plating. Beneath the thick layers of... Vatral, meanwhile, was having the time of his life. The more he studied the chemical transformation, the more fascinated he became. The spores themselves were relatively benign, native to a moon once colonized by the Veltori, known for their symbiotic ecosystem. On their own, the spores did nothing. In human sweat, however, they triggered a unique chemical cascade that resulted in a vapor that could, under the right conditions, become corrosive to specific synthetics. Vatral coined the term ecrovolic reaction, a blend of ecrine and volatility. He submitted a paper to the Galactic Journal of Exobiochemistry within 3 hours. By 1700, environmental sensors showed trace levels of acidic vapor still present in air ducts between decks 3 and 5. Containment protocols haven't failed, Vatral told Salinas, but we're skating the edge of a Category 2 biohazard. All from one guy's sweat? Yeah. Mark, now trying to eat soup through a straw inserted into his cooling suit, mumbled, "You're welcome." Next time, Salinas said, maybe jog around the arboretum instead of through it. I was around it, mostly. A sudden beep interrupted them. The ship's sensors picked up a spike in acidity levels in the nav station. What the hell's he doing in navigation? Salinas snapped. Mark raised his gloved hand. I needed to check something. Keela was already walking toward the door. That's it. He's confined to medbay. No argument here, Mark said. This suit is starting to smell like shame and warm batteries. As they left the command deck, a junior officer leaned into Salinas and whispered, Is he actually dangerous? Salinas shook her head. Only if he breaks a sweat. By the second day, Mark had officially become a scientific curiosity, a biohazard case study, and an unwilling celebrity on the Diligence. Half the crew avoided eye contact. The other half made bets on whether his next sneeze would take out a panel. I heard his socks burned through the laundry chute, someone whispered in the corridor. Pretty sure he melted the mesh on his bunk, another said in the commissary. Mark tried not to listen. It was hard to do that when the rumors traveled faster than the ship's sublight engines. He sat in medbay, hunched on the examination platform in his second cooling suit. The first had developed seam leaks after 12 hours of operation. Dr. Vatral was standing over a centrifuge, studying a fresh sample of Mark's sweat. The fluid had been collected with extreme care, using electrostatic tongs and a containment vial that normally held corrosive planetary acid samples. Vatral hummed, intrigued. The reaction is deepening. The chemical profile is mutating even in isolation. The compounds are growing more active. Mark wiped his brow out of instinct, then flinched. Please tell me that's not a bad thing? It's a scientific thing, Vatral said helpfully. Whether it's bad depends on your proximity. That's not comforting. Keela stood guard near the door, arms folded. You're now restricted to the clean enclosure unless escorted. No exceptions. Even for the bathroom? We've installed a portable unit. Mark buried his face in his hands. Fantastic. Just fantastic. He spent the next hour in the isolation cubicle, which was essentially a glorified plexiglass coffin with vents, temperature regulators, and an integrated dehumidifier. Everything he touched was synthetic ceramic or non-reactive metal. Even the cot had been swapped out for a pressure-neutral gel slab. I feel like a radioactive lizard in a pet store display, he muttered. Outside the enclosure, Vitrill adjusted his scans. Your hydration levels are dropping faster than I'd like. I'm administering extra fluids intravenously. You must remain cool and calm. Do you have any idea how hard that is, when I know I'm sweating acid gas? I recommend meditation. I recommend sedation. Vitriol tilted his head thoughtfully. That can be arranged. By evening, environmental teams had flagged 6 more sites of mild corrosion. The ship's ventilation filters were struggling to keep up, especially in areas near heat exhausts and busy corridors. While none of the damage was critical, the signs were unmistakable. Mark's sweat, though not inherently dangerous in a vacuum, became problematic when circulated across the ship in vapor form. The reaction is not self-sustaining, Vitrill explained during a senior staff meeting. It requires his continuous physical output. But in a closed-loop system like this ship, even minor exposure compounds over time. We have 16 humans aboard, Selena said, brows drawn. Why him? Unknown. Possibly a unique mineral composition, a rare microbiotic colony on his skin. Or just bad luck. Mark sat at the far end of the room, sipping electrolyte water and trying to ignore the engineer from Deck 9, who stared like he might explode at any second. It's gotta be the gym, the engineer blurted finally. He sweated through the wall panels. You can see the bubbling. I didn't melt anything on purpose, Mark said. I was exercising. That's allowed. Not anymore, Keela deadpanned. Captain Isari, an aging but sharp-eyed Ilvarian with a deep fondness for order, finally raised a hand. Dr. Vitrill, can this be reversed? The room went quiet. Vitrill paused. If we identify the specific fungal spore responsible and neutralize its chemical residue within his system, then yes, we could eliminate the reaction. Time frame? Connection mechanism. We must first identify the compound's precise interaction mechanism. Mark leaned forward. Meaning, I sit in a cube while you experiment on my sweat? Vitrill didn't blink. Correct. Over the next 24 hours, Medbay transformed into a makeshift biolab. Dozens of test samples were taken from Mark's sweat, skin cells, saliva, even eyelashes. Each sample was subjected to various compounds to map the behavior of the Acrovolec reaction. Some combinations fizzed violently, others turned cloudy, and one briefly ignited under a microscope. That one's off the table, Vitrill noted dryly. Mark was kept hydrated and cooled, monitored constantly. His meals were pre-chilled protein slurries delivered through a pressure-lock chamber. Conversation became limited, partly because he was always under observation, partly because everyone was too nervous to get close. Keela, Mark said during a lull, level with me. How bad is it? She glanced over the readings. Let's put it this way. You're the only person I've ever seen forced into enforced relaxation under threat of hull erosion. He chuckled weakly. Bet that doesn't look great on a personnel report. You'll be a legend. Vitrill suddenly perked up. I may have found something. Sample 214 exhibited a reversed reaction when introduced to a compound found in Torellian moss extract. Reverse like stops the acid vapor? Mark asked, cautiously hopeful. It neutralized the reactive bond. However, it also hardened the sample into a crystal matrix. Mark blinked. So, I could turn into a salt lick. I would not recommend using the term lick near anything this volatile. Salinas, now on site, tapped the screen. If it neutralizes the sweat, we might be able to extract it and isolate the chemical dampener. Mark eyed them both. I'll try anything. Just tell me. It doesn't go through the nose. The compound was administered slowly, intravenously, and through dermal absorption patches. Over the next several hours, Mark's sweat glands were monitored with the ship's most advanced nanoscopic sensors. To everyone's relief, the acidity in his sweat began to drop. By late evening, the vaporization had ceased entirely. Vent sensors registered no more corrosion patterns. The ducts, finally, were clean. "You're stable," Vatral said at last. "For now." Mark exhaled deeply. "You have no idea how good it feels to be boring again." "You are anything but boring," Vatral muttered, already writing another scientific paper. Mark was released the following day, still in a modified cooling suit but free to move within limited zones. His return to the crew was met with awkward smiles, light applause, and one banner reading, "Congratulations on not dissolving the ship." He walked past it with a sheepish grin. Keela walked beside him. "How's it feel to be room temperature dangerous instead of high temperature dangerous?" "Like an upgrade," Mark said. "Still sweaty, though." "You always will be." Mark looked around the familiar corridors, now cleaner, shinier, and corrosion-free. "Guess next time I'll jog around the Arboretum, really far around." Vatril's voice came through the comm just then. Final note," he said. "Do not re-enter Corridor 5 Delta without a full decontamination suit. The spores, while mostly inert now, may still be active under specific thermal shifts." Mark raised a brow. "So, still dangerous?" "Let's just say we've cordoned it off and renamed it." "What's it called now?" "Weller's Wake." 3 weeks later, Weller's Wake was still sealed, and Mark Weller's reputation had only grown stranger. Despite the thorough neutralization of the vapor-producing reaction, the incident had wormed its way into the Diligence's shipboard culture like a persistent urban legend. The crew now referred to routine jogs as acid drills. The gym posted a new rule reading, "No human sweat" on shared equipment, and someone had drawn a permanent chalk outline of a melted foot on the floor outside Corridor 5 Delta. Mark had tried to laugh it off. Mostly he succeeded. He no longer required a cooling suit, though Vatral made him wear a dermal patch sensor just in case. There'd been no recurrence, no new corrosion. But he hadn't jogged since. Instead, he started walking laps late at night, quiet, solitary routes that kept him far from ventilation intakes and anything with the word biome on it. At first, it was about caution, then about reflection. Because for the first time since joining the interspecies exploration fleet, Mark Weller genuinely understood how alien he was. It wasn't the vapor, or the containment breach, or the fact that his body had, for a brief moment, produced a substance that could ruin titanium. It was the way everyone looked at him now. Not with fear, exactly, but with careful awe. Like he was a live wire no one wanted to trip. Even Keela, who had once mocked him mercilessly, now chose her words more precisely. Salinas, whose sarcasm could burn through steel, had gone oddly diplomatic around him. And Vatral, brilliant, obsessive Vatral, was watching him the way scientists watch stars collapse. Fascinated, reverent, just a little bit afraid. It was exhausting. Mark stood in the observation lounge one evening, gazing out at the cold swirl of a proto-nebula the Diligence was skimming. His reflection looked tired in the glass, paler than before. A soft chime behind him broke the silence. Vatral entered, arms full of data slates and analysis sheets. "Ah, I suspected you'd be here." "Just needed air I can't dissolve," Mark said, only half joking. Vatral stood beside him, watching the gas tendrils swirl in the distance. "You've been distant." "Trying not to be a safety hazard." "You never were, not really." Mark turned. "You literally shut down half the deck." "I overreacted," Vatral said smoothly. "In my defense, I thought your insides were melting." Still my favorite medical quote ever. Vatral hesitated. "I have finished my final analysis." "It might interest you." Mark nodded slowly. "Hit me." "The reaction you triggered, this ecrovolic anomaly, it only occurred because of 3 highly specific variables. First, the spores in their unstable aerobic state. Second, a trace mineral present in your sweat that isn't typical for human profiles. Third, Vatral pause for effect, an elevated presence of isoprene emissions from your skin. Mark blinked. Isoprene? A hydrocarbon humans release more during stress, emotional distress specifically. Your body chemistry was altered by prolonged strain, mental and physical. So you're telling me my anxiety weaponized my sweat? Vitriol lifted all four shoulders in a shrug. Inaccurate, but emotionally satisfying phrasing. Mark rubbed his temples. So this wasn't just a biological accident, it was psychosomatic? No, it was environmental chemistry, triggered by a human under pressure. You were not at fault, you were reactive. Mark exhaled. Terrific. Now I'm dangerous and fragile. Not fragile, adaptive. They stood in silence again for a moment. Then Mark asked, "Is it gone? The mineral, the isoprene, the reactive junk?" "For now. But if you experience similar levels of emotional strain in similar environmental conditions, I could turn into a portable acid sprinkler again." "It's unlikely, but possible." Mark laughed, quiet, bitter, a little hollow. "How comforting." Vatral tapped the datapad. "This reaction may never happen again in your lifetime, but the knowledge from it is already revolutionizing xenobiochemistry. Cross-species environmental reactivity, adaptive biohazard modeling, even predictive metabolic engineering." Adjo Angus relaxed. He relished xeno. Mark looked sideways at him. "So, I'm famous in the lab circuit now?" "In some circles, yes." "Do I get a plaque?" "No. But there's a new sterilization protocol named after you." "Oh, joy." Vatral hesitated. Then, in a rare moment of softness, he said, "You did not melt. You adapted. You endured." Mark's smile was faint, but real. "That's the nicest way anyone's ever said you didn't die to me." Weeks passed. The Diligence completed its survey near the nebula and charted a new route toward a binary star cluster. Corridor 5 Delta remained sealed and pressurized, not out of necessity anymore, but out of quiet reverence. It was repurposed as a backup airlock, now lined with reinforced polymer and a warning panel that read, "Caution, human-sensitive materials only." Mark returned to normal duty. He walked the halls without the suit, without the looks. The crew adjusted, slowly, and in time, so did he. He started jogging again. Light at first, on the isolated lower deck with recycled air and an emergency vent switch. He watched his hydration, tracked his body heat, and ignored the nervous glances when he passed maintenance techs. Keela jogged with him once, and made it 2 laps before quitting with a smirk and a wheeze. "You still melt stuff?" she asked. "Nope. But I might if you make me laugh too hard." "Fair enough." At the next officer's dinner, he was seated beside Salinas and across from Vatral. Someone asked him what sweating felt like, and he responded with a vivid description that made the Zeran quartermaster faint. He made a joke, people laughed. The air at last felt breathable again. A month later, Mark stood alone once more in the observation lounge, watching a pair of stars orbit one another in chaotic, flaming spirals. He was sipping synth-caf, warm, not cold. He was sweating just a little, and the vents stayed clean. Vatral entered silently, stood beside him, hands clasped behind his back. "Environmental systems report no anomalies." "Good to hear," Mark said. "You've stopped being a threat." Mark chuckled. "Told you. I'm just sweating." Vatral gave a soft, rare smile. "I never doubted your sincerity, just your biology." Mark raised his mug in a half-toast. "To not melting." Vatral returned the gesture with a datapad. "To the persistence of the improbable." They watched the stars dance, 2 burning spheres locked in gravitational tension, spinning around one another without ever truly colliding. Much like them. And for once, Mark Weller didn't mind being a curiosity. He was human. He leaked, he glitched, he corroded ship parts by accident, but he endured. And the ship endured with him. The galaxy was a strange place. But so were humans.